It was a chilly morning when Jonathan Langston, a man who had everything luxury, power, wealth, decided to leave it all behind, if only for a little while. To the world, Jonathan was a self-made millionaire, with a life most people could only dream of. But behind his tailored suits and lavish lifestyle, there was a secret he had carried since childhood. He was adopted. For years, he wondered about his biological parents. Who were they? Why had they given him up? Did they know about the man he had become? Despite the success he had built from nothing, a void remained in Jonathan's heart. So, one day, he made a bold decision. He would find his birth parents. But he wasn't just going to show up at their door as the famous Jonathan Langston, the business tycoon who appeared in magazines and on TV. No, he wanted to know how they would react to him without the trappings of his wealth and fame. He wanted to meet them as an ordinary man, with no clues about his fortune. The plan was simple but risky. He would disguise himself, live like an average person, and approach them to see how they would treat a stranger in need. Jonathan wasn't used to deception, but this was different. It was personal. The disguise was essential, not because he was ashamed of who he was, but because he didn't want his wealth to cloud their first real meeting. He wanted their reaction to be genuine. But even as he prepared for the journey, doubts gnawed at him. What if they had moved on, built a new life, or worse, forgotten about him entirely? His mind raced with questions, but there was only one way to get answers. With his appearance carefully altered, his signature sleek hair hidden under a worn-out cap, his designer clothes swapped for second-hand jeans, and a plain jacket, Jonathan transformed into an entirely different man. He even bought an old car to complete the look. Gone was the confident, sharp entrepreneur everyone knew. In his place was a man who looked like he was just scraping by, someone easily overlooked. After months of searching and following leads, he finally found an address in a quiet suburban neighborhood that led him to a modest home. His heart pounded as he drove up, staring at the small, weathered house that could very well hold the answers to his lifelong questions. As he stood at the front door, an uneasy feeling settled in his stomach. What would they think of him? What if they didn't recognize him? Or worse, what if they didn't want to meet him at all? Taking a deep breath, Jonathan knocked. The sound echoed in the stillness of the morning, and for a moment there was no response. Seconds felt like hours as he stood there, bracing himself for whatever came next. Finally, the door creaked open, and an older woman with kind but tired eyes appeared in the doorway. Her gaze swept over him, not a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She smiled faintly, as though she were used to strangers knocking on her door. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but guarded. Jonathan cleared his throat, his carefully rehearsed lines suddenly escaping him. I'm looking for someone. I think you might be my parents." The woman blinked, startled, her smile fading. For a long moment, she said nothing, her eyes searching his face for some hint of familiarity. "I'm sorry, who did you say you were?" Jonathan hesitated. This was it, the moment of truth. Should he reveal who he really was, or should he stick to his plan? His heart pounded in his chest as he stood there, caught between two worlds, the man he had become and the child he had once been, longing to be found. Before he could speak, another voice cut through the silence. "Who's at the door, Helen?" A man's voice, gruff but warm, called from inside the house. Seconds later, an older man, his graying hair and weary expression mirroring the woman's, appeared behind her. The moment felt like an eternity as Jonathan stood on their doorstep, unsure of what to do next. Should he tell them everything now, or let them think he was just a stranger in need, as he had planned? His mind swirled with uncertainty, and in that split second, he knew that whatever happened next would change his life forever. But as their eyes met his, Jonathan could sense something in the air, something he couldn't quite place. Did they know? Had they been waiting for this moment just as long as he had? The tension was unbearable. And then, Just as he opened his mouth to say something, the older woman's face changed, her eyes widening with a sudden realization. Wait, could it be? The air felt heavier as Jonathan stood there, caught in the moment between recognition and doubt. The older woman, Helen, her eyes locked on his, seemed to struggle with something deep within her memory. Her mouth parted slightly, but no words came. It was as though she was piecing together fragments of a long-lost puzzle, a puzzle Jonathan had unknowingly stepped into. Her husband, standing beside her, looked confused but concerned, his brow furrowing as he watched his wife's reaction. Jonathan didn't know how to respond. His heart was pounding, his pulse quickening with each second of silence. The plan was falling apart. He had expected a polite conversation, maybe even indifference. He hadn't expected this. He could feel the weight of the moment closing in on him, the tension making it harder to breathe. Jonathan began, but his voice caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say next, didn't know how to continue. Helen took a step closer, her gaze still fixed on him. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly. "Your eyes," she whispered, almost to herself. "They're just like his." Jonathan froze. His mind raced. Whose eyes? Was she talking about his father? Was she starting to realize the truth? His throat felt dry as he fought the urge to spill everything right then and there, to drop the disguise and reveal who he really was. But he couldn't. Not yet. Helen's husband, still in the dark, finally spoke up. "Helen, what are you talking about? Who is this man?" His voice held a hint of frustration, clearly unsettled by her behavior. She didn't answer him right away. Her eyes never left Jonathan's face, her mind clearly swimming with memories or thoughts too complicated to voice. Jonathan could see the battle in her expression, the uncertainty, the hope, the fear. And suddenly, he realized that maybe this wasn't going to be as simple as he had imagined. Maybe they weren't just two strangers he was reconnecting with. Maybe they, too, had lived with questions and secrets all these years. I'm sorry," Jonathan finally said, stepping back slightly, feeling the need to retreat from the intensity of the situation. "I think I've made a mistake. I didn't mean to intrude." But Helen reached out and gently grabbed his arm, stopping him from leaving. "No," she said, her voice stronger now. "Don't go. Please. Just tell us who you are. Why are you here?" The fear in her voice was palpable. It was as if she already knew the answer, but was afraid to hear it. Jonathan felt the pressure mounting again, his own emotions threatening to spill over. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his head, but now that he was standing in front of them, it was more difficult than he had ever imagined. I was adopted," Jonathan said slowly, his eyes watching for their reactions. "I've been looking for my birth parents for a long time." Helen gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. Her husband's face changed, his expression hardening slightly as he processed Jonathan's words. The tension between them was almost unbearable. "And you think we're your parents?" the older man asked, his voice gruff, but there was something vulnerable in his tone, something that made Jonathan's heart ache. Jonathan nodded slowly, watching as the reality of his words began to sink in. The silence stretched out between them, the weight of unspoken truths hanging in the air. He could see the pain in their faces, the years of wondering, the unanswered questions that were now crashing down around them. Helen's hand dropped from her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. "But how? How could this be?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jonathan swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been searching for a long time. I never thought I'd actually find you." Helen took a step closer, her hands shaking. We had to give him up," she said, her voice breaking. "It was the hardest thing we ever did, but we had no choice. We were young, and we thought it was the right thing." Jonathan could feel the tears welling up in his own eyes, the emotions he had been holding back for so long threatening to overwhelm him. He had always wondered why they had given him up, what had happened to make them make that choice. Now, standing in front of them, he realized that they had carried their own pain, their own burden of regret and loss. Why now? Helen's husband asked, his voice filled with both curiosity and caution. Why after all this time? What made you come looking for us? Jonathan hesitated. How could he explain his life, his journey, his decision to hide his true identity? He didn't want to overwhelm them with the details of his wealth, his status, or the life he had built. This moment wasn't about that. It was about finding the truth, finding them. I needed to know, he said simply, his voice soft but steady. I needed to know where I came from. The older man nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he studied Jonathan's face. There was a quiet understanding in his gaze, a recognition of the courage it must have taken to seek them out after all these years. But there was also something else, something unsaid, something hidden. Helen, still trembling, stepped closer and took Jonathan's hands in hers. You came back, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. You came back to us. Jonathan's chest tightened, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had found them, after all these years. But now that he was here, standing in front of them, he realized that the hardest part was still to come. Jonathan felt a surge of emotions as Helen's hands gripped his. Her words echoed in his mind. You came back. He had come looking for answers, but now, standing on the threshold of their home, it felt like a door had opened to something far deeper than he anticipated. There was relief, but also an unexpected weight pressing on him. For a moment, he allowed himself to bask in the warmth of her words, to believe that this reunion was going to heal all the unanswered questions he had carried for so long. But then, something shifted. Helen's husband, whose name Jonathan realized he still didn't know, wasn't looking at him with the same soft expression as his wife. His eyes were darker now, filled with something unreadable. He still hadn't let go of that initial guardedness, and Jonathan could feel the tension rising between them. The man took a slow, deliberate step forward, his gaze never leaving Jonathan's face. You said you've been looking for us, the older man said, his voice low but pointed. But why didn't anyone reach out to us sooner? Why come now, after all these years? Jonathan hesitated, unsure of how to answer. He didn't want to lie, but he wasn't ready to reveal the whole truth yet, especially not about his wealth. The old man's tone carried a suspicion that made Jonathan feel uneasy. Why did it matter now? Why did this reunion feel so fragile? I didn't know where to find you until recently, Jonathan said carefully, choosing his words. It took a long time to get the information I needed. There was a pause, a flicker of doubt crossing the man's face. Jonathan could sense there was something else going on, something unspoken. He was about to say more when the man interrupted him, his voice laced with tension. You don't understand what you're walking into, the older man said, his eyes narrowing. There are things you don't know, things we couldn't tell you back then, and maybe things you still don't want to know. Jonathan blinked, caught off guard. His heart began to race. What did he mean by that? What could they have kept hidden all these years? He had come looking for the truth, but now it seemed like the truth was even more complicated than he had imagined. What do you mean? Jonathan asked, his voice steady but laced with growing concern. Helen's expression changed, her grip tightening on Jonathan's hands. She glanced nervously at her husband, as if pleading with him to stay quiet, but the tension in the room had already spilled over. Jonathan could feel it now. Something was wrong. The reunion, the relief, the joy, suddenly it all felt too fragile, too tenuous. He had come searching for answers, but he was beginning to realize that the answers might come at a price. We didn't want to give you up, Helen said softly, her voice trembling. It wasn't our choice. We had no control over what happened. Jonathan frowned. What do you mean? You said you were young, that you thought it was the right thing to do. Helen looked down, her eyes filling with tears. That's what we told ourselves, she whispered. But the truth is, we weren't the ones who decided. There were people involved. Powerful people. Jonathan's heart sank. He had never considered that there might have been external forces at play, that someone else might have controlled the course of his life before he was even old enough to remember. Suddenly, his mind filled with questions. Who were these powerful people, and why had they forced his parents to give him up? Helen's husband stepped forward, his face hardening. You weren't just any baby, Jonathan, he said, his voice low but steady. Your adoption wasn't a normal one. There were people who, let's just say, they had a vested interest in making sure you were raised by someone else. The room seemed to shrink around Jonathan, the walls closing in as the gravity of their words sunk in. What was this about? Was there something more to his adoption than he had ever known? His entire life, he had believed that his parents had given him up out of necessity, out of circumstance. Now it seemed like there had been a shadow lurking behind those decisions all along. I don't understand, Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Who were these people? And why would they care what happened to me? Helen looked at her husband, her face pale. She seemed to be struggling with whether to speak the words aloud, as though revealing this secret might somehow undo everything. But then, after a long, tense pause, she finally spoke. They were connected to the people who adopted you, she said, her voice shaking. The ones who raised you, they weren't just random strangers. You came back, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. You came back to us. Jonathan's chest tightened, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had found them, after all these years. But now that he was here, standing in front of them, he realized that the hardest part was still to come. Jonathan felt a surge of emotions as Helen's hands gripped his. Her words echoed in his mind. You came back. He had come looking for answers, but now, standing on the threshold of their home, it felt like a door had opened to something far deeper than he anticipated. There was relief, but also an unexpected weight pressing on him. For a moment, he allowed himself to bask in the warmth of her words, to believe that this reunion was going to heal all the unanswered questions he had carried for so long. But then, something shifted. Helen's husband, whose name Jonathan realized he still didn't know, wasn't looking at him with the same soft expression as his wife. His eyes were darker now, filled with something unreadable. He still hadn't let go of that initial guardedness, and Jonathan could feel the tension rising between them. The man took a slow, deliberate step forward, his gaze never leaving Jonathan's face. You said you've been looking for us, the older man said, his voice low but pointed. But why didn't anyone reach out to us sooner? Why come now, after all these years? Jonathan hesitated, unsure of how to answer. He didn't want to lie, but he wasn't ready to reveal the whole truth yet, especially not about his wealth. The old man's tone carried a suspicion that made Jonathan feel uneasy. Why did it matter now? Why did this reunion feel so fragile? I didn't know where to find you until recently, Jonathan said carefully, choosing his words. It took a long time to get the information I needed. There was a pause, a flicker of doubt crossing the man's face. Jonathan could sense there was something else going on, something unspoken. He was about to say more when the man interrupted him, his voice laced with tension. You don't understand what you're walking into, the older man said, his eyes narrowing. There are things you don't know, things we couldn't tell you back then, and maybe things you still don't want to know. Jonathan blinked, caught off guard. His heart began to race. What did he mean by that? What could they have kept hidden all these years? He had come looking for the truth, but now it seemed like the truth was even more complicated than he had imagined. What do you mean? Jonathan asked, his voice steady, but laced with growing concern. Helen's expression changed, her grip tightening on Jonathan's hands. She glanced nervously at her husband, as if pleading with him to stay quiet, but the tension in the room had already spilled over. Jonathan could feel it now. Something was wrong. The reunion, the relief, the joy, suddenly it all felt too fragile, too tenuous. He had come searching for answers, but he was beginning to realize that the answers might come at a price. "We didn't want to give you up," Helen said softly, her voice trembling. "It wasn't our choice. We had no control over what happened." Jonathan frowned. "What do you mean? You said you were young, that you thought it was the right thing to do." Helen looked down, her eyes filling with tears. "That's what we told ourselves," she whispered. "But the truth is, we weren't the ones who decided. There were people involved. Powerful people." Jonathan's heart sank. He had never considered that there might have been external forces at play, that someone else might have controlled the course of his life before he was even old enough to remember. Suddenly, his mind filled with questions. Who were these powerful people, and why had they forced his parents to give him up? Helen's husband stepped forward, his face hardening. "You weren't just any baby, Jonathan," he said, his voice low but steady. "Your adoption wasn't a normal one. There were people who, let's just say, they had a vested interest in making sure you were raised by someone else." The room seemed to shrink around Jonathan, the walls closing in as the gravity of their words sunk in. What was this about? Was there something more to his adoption than he had ever known? His entire life, he had believed that his parents had given him up out of necessity, out of circumstance. Now, it seemed like there had been a shadow lurking behind those decisions all along. "I don't understand," Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who were these people? And why would they care what happened to me?" Helen looked at her husband, her face pale. She seemed to be struggling with whether to speak the words aloud, as though revealing this secret might somehow undo everything. But then, after a long, tense pause, she finally spoke. "They were connected to the people who adopted you," she said, her voice shaking. "The ones who raised you, they weren't just random strangers. They were chosen. There was a reason they picked you, Jonathan. You were part of something much bigger." Jonathan's mind raced as he tried to piece together what she was saying. His adoptive parents, who he had always believed had taken him in out of love, had been chosen? By whom? And why? He could feel the weight of this revelation settling on his shoulders. The realization that his entire life had been shaped by forces he didn't even know existed. "What? What are you talking about?" Jonathan asked, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Chosen for what?" Helen's husband stepped forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "We don't know all the details," he admitted, his face dark. "But we do know this. The people who arranged your adoption, they had plans for you. They were watching you from the moment you were born." Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. "Plans? What kind of plans?" The man shook his head. "We don't know exactly, but we were told never to look for you. That's why we never did. They made sure we understood what would happen if we ever tried to contact you." The room went silent as Jonathan absorbed their words. Everything he thought he knew about his past was unraveling in front of him. Who were these mysterious people, and what did they want with him? His mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, but there were still too many missing. "I don't believe this," Jonathan said, shaking his head. "Why would anyone do this? Why would they care about me?" Helen's eyes filled with tears once again. "We never wanted to give you up, Jonathan," she said softly, "but we had no choice. And now that you've found us, I'm afraid it's only a matter of time before they find out." The words sent a jolt of fear through Jonathan. Who were they, and what would they do now that he had uncovered the truth? Jonathan stood there, feeling as if the ground had shifted beneath him. His parents, his biological parents, had been forced to give him up, manipulated by unseen forces. People had been watching him, shaping his life from the shadows, and he hadn't even known. The walls of the small house seemed to close in on him as the weight of these revelations bore down. Helen's face, pale and tear-streaked, only made the truth more chilling. Her husband's words, delivered in a low, urgent tone, echoed in his mind. They're watching. They have plans for you. He couldn't comprehend why anyone would go to such lengths to control his fate. He had built his fortune from the ground up, become a millionaire through hard work and determination. Yet, the idea that his life had been orchestrated from the start, that someone had planned it all, left him feeling powerless, like a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. Jonathan's breath quickened. "What do they want from me?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Why me?" Helen's husband, grim-faced, took a step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "We never found out exactly, but from what we gathered, it has something to do with your adoptive family. Whoever they are, they weren't just wealthy people, they had connections, deep connections. We were told that you were meant to carry on something important." Jonathan's head spun. His adoptive parents had never been particularly secretive, but now, in retrospect, he could recall moments that had seemed odd, brief mentions of meetings, business deals that never seemed to involve him. Had they been part of this mysterious plan? Were they the ones keeping him in the dark? "I need to know more," Jonathan said, a sense of urgency rising in him. "There has to be a way to figure out what they want from me." Helen looked at him with sadness in her eyes. "We were warned, Jonathan," she said quietly. "Warned that if we ever spoke of this, if we ever tried to reconnect with you, there would be consequences. We don't know who these people are, but they're powerful. And they don't make idle threats." Jonathan's mind raced. He was no longer just searching for his past, he was trying to uncover something much bigger. The stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. As he tried to piece it all together, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He hesitated for a moment before pulling it out. A new message flashed across the screen, but the number was unrecognizable. The words, however, sent a chill down his spine. "Stop looking. You've gone too far." Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. His hands shook as he stared at the message, the threat all too clear. They knew. Whoever had been pulling the strings from the beginning was still watching, still controlling. His every move was being monitored. His eyes darted back to Helen and her husband. "They know I'm here," Jonathan said, his voice barely a whisper. "They're already watching." Helen's face went pale, her hands trembling. Her husband's jaw clenched as he looked at Jonathan, his expression hardening. "You have to leave," the man said, his voice firm. "Now, before they do something worse." Jonathan's mind was a blur. He couldn't just leave, not without answers. But before he could respond, the sound of tires screeching outside cut through the tense silence. All three of them froze, their eyes wide with fear. Jonathan's heart raced as he glanced toward the window. A sleek black car had pulled up outside, its tinted windows giving no hint of who was inside. But Jonathan knew. He could feel it. Whoever was in that car had come for him. Panic surged through him. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely controlled. Helen's husband grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the back door. "There's no time," he said urgently. "You have to go. Now." Jonathan felt his feet moving before his mind had fully caught up. He followed them out the back door, the cool evening air hitting his face as they rushed toward the alley behind the house. His thoughts raced, a mixture of fear and determination taking over. He had uncovered something dangerous, and now he had no choice but to face it head on. But just as they reached the alley, a voice called out from behind them. "Jonathan Langston." Jonathan froze. He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, to see a man stepping out of the shadows. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. His presence exuded power, control, the kind of authority that didn't need to raise its voice to be feared. "You've learned too much," the man said, his voice calm, almost polite. "It's time for this to end." Jonathan's blood ran cold. He stood rooted to the spot, his mind screaming for him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Helen and her husband stood behind him, their faces filled with dread. The man's words hung in the air like a final sentence, an inescapable fate. "I don't understand," Jonathan said, his voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The man smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "It's not what we want from you, Jonathan. It's what you were always meant to become." Before Jonathan could respond, the man pulled something from his coat, a small silver device that looked unfamiliar yet ominously powerful. Jonathan's heart raced as he stared at it, unsure of what was about to happen. But then, just as the man raised the device, something unexpected happened. A second car screeched to a halt in the alley, and two men in suits jumped out, shouting at the first man. Chaos erupted. In the confusion, Jonathan, Helen, and her husband bolted, running down the alley and disappearing into the night. As they fled, Jonathan's mind raced, trying to process everything that had just happened. He didn't know who those new men were, or why they had intervened, but it had bought them time. Time to escape, time to figure out what the truth really was. But as they ran, Jonathan realized something chilling. He had been searching for his parents, for answers about his past. But now, as he glanced back over his shoulder at the alley behind them, he knew one thing for sure: whoever was pulling the strings wasn't done with him yet. The real game had only just begun. Jonathan's breath came in ragged gasps as they ran, his legs burning with each step. Helen and her husband kept pace, fear driving them forward through the dark, twisting alleyways. The night had taken on a surreal quality, the events of the last few minutes spinning in his mind. The men, the device, the sudden intervention, it all seemed like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But it was real, too real. As they reached the end of the alley, Helen's husband pulled them into a small hidden doorway, ducking inside before anyone could see them. Jonathan collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His mind raced, the unanswered questions pounding in his skull. Who were those men? What did they want from him? And more importantly, how much danger were they really in? Helen leaned against the wall beside him, her face pale and drawn. Her husband, still catching his breath, looked out cautiously, watching the alley for any sign of pursuit. "We can't stay here," Jonathan said, his voice barely a whisper. "They'll find us. They're probably already looking. But what do they want?" Jonathan asked, frustration rising in his voice. "Why go through all of this just to control me? What am I to them?" Jonathan's brow furrowed. "What power? I'm just a man. I built my business from nothing. No one handed me anything." Helen shook her head. It wasn't about wealth. It was never about that. They saw something in you, something that had nothing to do with money. It was your potential, your ability to influence, to change things. They've been shaping you for something bigger than you realize. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. He had spent his whole life believing he was in control, that his success had been the result of his own hard work. But now, it seemed like everything had been manipulated from the start, like he had been a puppet in a larger game. And whoever these people were, they had plans for him that went far beyond what he could have imagined. "We need to find out who's behind this," Jonathan said, his voice steadier now, despite the fear gnawing at him. "We can't keep running. I need answers." Helen's husband frowned. "That's easier said than done. These people, whoever they are, they don't leave trails. They've been in the shadows for a long time, controlling things from behind the scenes. Finding them won't be easy." Jonathan thought for a moment, his mind racing. "But we know they're watching. That message I got. They know every move I make. Maybe that's our advantage." Helen looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Jonathan stood up, pacing the small space as an idea began to form. "If they're watching me, they'll expect me to keep running. They'll think I'm scared, that I don't have a plan. But what if I turn the tables? What if I use their surveillance against them?" Helen's husband crossed his arms, skeptical. "And how do you plan to do that?" Jonathan met his gaze, determination hardening his features. "I have resources. People who can trace things, find patterns, dig up information that others can't. If they're watching me, then they're leaving a trail, digital footprints, surveillance feeds, something. I can use my connections to track them down. But we need to be careful. One wrong move, and we could be walking into a trap." Helen's husband considered it for a moment before nodding. "It's risky, but it might be the only chance we have." Jonathan pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed a number. It rang twice before a voice on the other end answered. "Mr. Langston? I need your help," Jonathan said, his voice low but urgent. "I'm sending you some information. I want you to trace it, find out who's behind it, where they're coming from. And be discreet. No one can know you're doing this." There was a pause on the other end before the voice responded. "Understood. I'll get on it right away." Jonathan hung up, his heart still racing. He had just set a plan in motion, but whether it would work or not was still uncertain. He glanced at Helen and her husband. "We need to lie low for a while. Stay out of sight until we have something concrete to go on." They agreed, and for the next few days, they moved cautiously, staying in the shadows, changing locations frequently. Jonathan's team worked tirelessly behind the scenes, combing through digital records, tracing the mysterious messages, trying to uncover the identity of the people who had been watching him his entire life. The waiting was agonizing, every moment filled with the fear that they could be found at any second. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Jonathan's phone buzzed with a message. It was from his contact. "We found something. Meet me at location I'm sending. Come alone." Jonathan's heart raced as he read the message. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He looked at Helen and her husband. "Stay here," he said firmly. "I'll go and find out what they've discovered. If I'm not back in an hour, you'll know something's wrong." Helen looked at him with concern, but she nodded. "Be careful." Jonathan left the safe house, his mind focused, his every sense alert as he made his way to the rendezvous point. The location was an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, abandoned, desolate, the kind of place where secrets were meant to stay hidden. His contact was waiting for him, standing in the shadows near the entrance. "They're deeper than we thought," the man said quietly as Jonathan approached. "Whoever these people are, they've covered their tracks well. But we managed to trace some of the communications back to a private organization, a group that's been operating under the radar for decades. They have connections to powerful people in finance, politics, even global corporations. And they've had their eye on you for a long time." Jonathan's blood ran cold. "What do they want from me?" The man hesitated. "That's the part we couldn't fully figure out. But we did find something else. There's a file on you your entire life, from the day you were born. They've documented everything, your achievements, your failures, your connections. It's like they've been preparing for something that involves you." Jonathan's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. He had spent his life in the public eye, building his business, making a name for himself. But now, it seemed like all of that had been part of a larger plan, one he had never been aware of. "Where's the file?" Jonathan asked. The man handed him a small flash drive. "It's all on here. But be careful, Jonathan. Once you start digging, there's no going back. They'll know you're getting close." Jonathan nodded, gripping the flash drive tightly in his hand. "Thank you." As he walked away from the warehouse, his mind churned with the weight of what he had just learned. He had spent his life trying to carve his own path, but now it seemed like that path had been laid out for him all along. And the people who had done it were still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to make their move. Back at the safe house, Jonathan plugged the flash drive into his laptop, his hands shaking as he opened the file. What he saw made his stomach turn. It was all there, his adoption records, his childhood photos, transcripts of his private conversations, even financial transactions he had thought were off the books. Every detail of his life had been meticulously catalogued, analyzed, and manipulated. But the final document on the drive was the most chilling. It was a projection, an outline of his future. It detailed plans for his involvement in a global venture, one that would require his influence, his wealth, and his connections. It was clear that they expected him to play a pivotal role in something much larger than himself, something that would affect not just his life, but the world at large. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had found the truth, but it had come at a cost. Now he had a choice to make: continue down the path they had set for him, or fight back and try to regain control of his own destiny. But before he could decide, there was one more document, one that changed everything. It was a list of names, people who had been part of this plan from the beginning. And at the top of that list was a name he never expected to see: his adoptive parents. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as he read their names again, his mind reeling. They had been part of this all along. The people who had raised him, who had loved him, who had guided him through life, they had been in on it. They had known what he was meant for, and they had never told him. It felt like the final betrayal, the last piece of the puzzle falling into place. Jonathan sat there in stunned silence, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He had found his answers, but they had only led to more questions he wasn't sure he wanted the answers to. But as he closed the laptop and stood up, he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't run from this anymore. The people who had controlled his life from the shadows were still out there, still pulling the strings. And if he didn't stop them, they would continue to control not just his life, but the lives of countless others. Jonathan took a deep breath, his mind clear for the first time in days. He had spent his life chasing success, thinking that it would give him control over his own destiny. But now he knew that true control came from facing the truth, no matter how difficult it was. And he was ready to face it head on. As he walked out of the safe house and into the night, Jonathan knew that his journey wasn't over. The battle was just beginning. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was in control of his own fate. And that was more powerful than anything those in the shadows could ever take from him.